Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show, I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of The Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, as well as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Like always, if I'm talking about something that you don't want to hear about, you can always look in the description down below because I include the times when I talk about each of the respective shows that I'm talking about. For example, if you want to hear what I have to say about this week's episode of The Flash, you can skip to what I had to say about Legends of Tomorrow or what I had to say about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D's episode this week. But the first thing we're going to talk about is this week's episode of The Flash. Barry has basically been suffering with the whole, what he found out in the mid-season finale, accidentally going to the future and finding out, what happens to Iris. And it's like, yeah, Jay told him, don't worry about it. There's so many possible futures. But the thing is, that's always a downside of knowing the future. It's always going to be racking through your head and brain. And Barry's just trying to live things up. He's unpacking everything at their place. It's like, because Iris is like, oh, let's just take the time. But for him, it's like, no, he's got to enjoy every moment because he doesn't know what's going to cause, problems right around the corner. Because the villain in this episode was Plunder. He's the same dude that when Barry went to the future, he saw his mug picture as he was being put on trial for all the robberies and stuff. And coming across with him kind of, Barry gets sidetracked because he's thinking this entire time he's focusing on that aspect when he should be focusing on, he's focusing on the fact that this guy played a part in the future. He was an event in the future. And it's at one point, Barry even is like, oh, I'm actually afraid to even arrest this dude because it's because he didn't know what kind of effect would have on the timeline. Side note, those bullets are pretty awesome. That gun is sick. Kind of sends out a shockwave. There's the whole net thing it did at the end of the episode that both Barry and Wally just kind of pushed through, but that was pretty cool. But I really like those bullets. They went past Barry, and Barry he dodged them, kind of like a Matrix type of situation. And then the bullets followed him, raced everywhere, and they're phased through him. He phases through the concrete, and the bullets hit it. And he slid when he did it too, which made it even more amazing. I was like, that is so sick. But then, because something Caitlin says in the episode kind of changes his mind. It's basically because Barry wanted to handle everything on his own, not telling anyone, not telling Iris. Iris is like, you're having all these nightmares. She's like, why don't you tell me? I'm here. You can tell me about stuff. He even goes as far as being like, okay, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened in my life. You know that better than anyone else. It's just obviously that's kind of what's, life has kind of gotten to me. So it's just that's what's happening instead of telling her the truth. But Caitlin brings up the fact is that because later on in the episode, obviously in the episode, she goes to Julian because she wants help on trying to remove her powers. Because the whole thing about the bracelets, they're a good solution, but for now, they're a temporary solution. She wants a permanent solution. She wants a way to make it so that she no longer needs the bracelets, that she gets rid of her meta powers, and she figured out of anyone, the person to go to is Julian, because Julian studied metas the best. Obviously, Julian at first isn't willing to help her, but, later on, it's understandable why. Because he brings up the reason why he doesn't want to help her is because she reminds him of what he did. She's dealing with trying to handle her dual personalities, being Caitlin, as well as, fearing who she could be as Killer Frost. But then you have, you have Julian, he's like, no, I don't have to worry about it. My hands are clean, all the stuff I did as alchemy. And it's he did a lot of bad things in alchemy because there's a lot of, there's even cops that died because of him working with Savitar and everything. So to him, it's just that blood is on his hands. So looking at Caitlin's situation made him reflect on his own, and it scared him because he tries to pretend he moved past it. He even Caitlin found out he's apparently, having trouble sleeping. So it's so interesting how this whole situation has affected them all in different ways. Barry's not the only one that's having trouble. But essentially saying that basically is we can't handle things on her own. Because it's basically every time we try to handle things on our own, there are catastrophic effects. And Barry kind of knows that firsthand. It's handling things on its own led to Flashpoint and led to a lot of all this stuff happening. So it kind of sunk in his Caitlin's we're stronger together. We able to get past no matter what the problem is. With his using Barry for example, his parents dying. The fact is he had Joe and Iris there when Cisco's brother Dante died. She was there for him. It's we need to be together instead of trying to handle things on our own. And so it sinks into Barry, so he was like, you know what? And he tells Iris the truth. Now that, legitimately is a heavy burden. Already knowing the future is bad enough, especially being who Barry is. He's a speedster. It's knowing the future can change everything. I mean, knowing the future is what motivates Eobard to be, the reverse Flash because he knew his future. Like, I think one of the storylines for Eobard, it doesn't necessarily, it hasn't really come up that being the thing, but basically Eobard ended up finding out his future before he became a bad guy, because it's like, oh, he admired the Flash, he wanted to be like the Flash, until he found out his future of like, oh, I'm going to be a supervillain. So he basically was like, hey, I might as well just go ahead and play that role. I think I could be completely wrong about that. I swear that's one of his storylines, or that, or misremembering it as like, the fact is he's like, if I can't beat a Flash, I'll be someone who could topple the Flash. So the competitive nature. I don't know. I feel like I might have heard both. I mean, I could be completely wrong with both too. So I mean, but either way, that'd be, even if that's true, it kind of nullifies what I said. But the example still stands of just like, knowing the future and you're a speedster, you have the power to change it. It's kind of like, it's very tempting and it's very nerve-wracking, because like Barry can't do too much, because it's like he already changed the past and screwed things up big time for the people around him. So it begs the question, like, how can he be so certain? Like, because the conversation he has with HR, because they didn't just keep it to themselves, they told everyone, with the exception of Joe, because it's like Joe got crazy about the whole, like, Wally being in his situation of when he was in that cocoon getting his powers as a speedster. She saw how worried he was about that, but finding out like, oh, his own daughter is gonna die, he won't be able to handle it. He'd be so focused on that rather than doing his job. Which there's two arguments to that. It's like, one, you should tell him, because we literally having a conversation right now of don't lie to each other, because it's like keeping secrets. It's what causes problems. That's what, like, people get blindsided by things early on. And if he finds out that Barry knew ahead of time what was going to happen, he's going to be super pissed at Barry. He's like, how could you keep this from me this entire time? And if it happens and they don't save Iris, he's going to almost resent Barry, be like, you knew what was going to happen and you did nothing. You have this power, yet you couldn't save my little girl, the woman that you claim to love. Kind of a similar situation with the whole Dante and Cisco situation. It's like, oh, you have the power to change the past. Oh, you changed the past to save your parents, but you can't go back in time to save my brother. Type of situation. It's like kind of like, almost a selfish nature type of thing. So, but the example, like, I like HR kind of breaks it down, because HR, Barry asks him like, oh, HR, where do you stand on the whole thing? And HR believes the past is set in stone. The future is set in stone. That basically you can try and go whatever path you want to, but destiny will always find a way to basically route you to the end goal. It's like that end goal is right there. You're always going to be there. Which kind of coincides with Legends of Tomorrow, but I'll kind of get into that later when it gets time to talk about Legends. But kind of, quickly coinciding, taking it like, taking Legends, for example, is Eobard's future. Like, we already know where Eobard's story ends, and that ends with him dying. That's kind of what he's doing when he's doing once again. I'm going to get to that later, but that's kind of the point I'm making, is like, things are set in stone. At least that's how it can seem, but the fact is there are multiple possibilities. You could argue that like everything will always end up at the same point. There's obviously different paths to taking it. So basically to come up with the decision, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to change the future. But, the example HR gave was like domino effects. It's like, yeah, you had like, essentially he doesn't outright say it, but it's basically like, okay, you knock over one domino that leads to another and so forth. Basically how time works. It's like, so the thing is you have to be careful about what you change, because you don't know what kind of effects would have, because it's like, you remove these certain events from the timeline and makes it so like, oh, this particular domino didn't fall in the line of events. But that also means that those events have changed and you don't know, it's just like the past. You don't know what, best example I can give, kind of, I'm going all over the place. It's Final Fantasy 13 too. There's a thing in the, you change the past, you change the future, you change the past. Obviously, that's kind of got its own time travel rules, and it might not necessarily apply, but it's something I've always thought was interesting. It's like you change the future, the past has to be rewritten to kind of act as a counterbalance. It's like the past has to be rewritten to create the new future that exists. Events in the past that were set in stone have to be, well, not necessarily set in stone, have to be changed so they fit the new narrative created by the new future. I don't know if Flash is going to have that same philosophy, but it's kind of the same thing of just like, even if they don't follow that path, it's still a situation of like, you don't know how the dominoes might affect. It's like, oh, you change these certain things here in the present, and it's like, yeah, it changes the past, but I mean, the future, I keep doing that, sorry. I'm definitely confusing the way I keep misplacing words like that. But it's like you don't know what the pathways are going to be. It's like, oh, the pathways are this way. Like, oh, this gets us to that future where Iris dies by Savitar. But you don't know what changing those small things will do to the future. It's like, oh yeah, it might create a better future, or it might create a worse future. Just once again, kind of like literally, it's like the Flashpoint situation, but in reverse. So rather than changing the past or changing the future, it's like there's still consequences for that too. Like, but they are trying to be smart about it. They're trying to like change certain events, like because they ended up finding out certain things about the future. It's like, okay, let's find those certain things, figure out some certain things about the future, and then we change them. You know, one is apparently the city's recovering from a gorilla attack. Can only assume that's Gorilla Grodd. He's got to pop up at least once a season. That is the case. Well, no, I think was it season 2 he popped up more than once? Or was that season 1? That might have been season 1 he popped up more than once. Nevertheless, that's obviously what that's leading to. So at some point during the season, because basically they ended up, you know, it seems that like at this point in time, this episode has stated like they've got 4 months until that Iris's death comes to be. But it's like at some point, Gorilla Grodd is going to attack the city. Apparently, Caitlyn's going to become Killer Frost because it's like, oh, Killer Frost is on the loose again. Now, a while back, I ended up making, well, not really a while back, like sometime last month, I ended up putting up a video where basically it's like, oh, my thoughts on who would end up betraying Team Flash. And obviously, everything's pointing towards Killer Frost. It's like, oh, yeah, she's going to end up serving Savitar, essentially. And I threw out the whole, like, Cisco situation. If you haven't seen the video, go check it out. But nevertheless, the point I was trying to get across is the fact is they don't know what changing the timeline will do. Like basically, it's like, oh, we're making things set in stone. Like, oh, it's saying that, oh, she'll become Killer Frost and she'll go off. But who's to say things won't change and kind of fit what I'm saying? It's like, oh, everything is so clear cut. Like, oh, she is the bad guy in this particular timeline. But who's to say when they start changing things, it doesn't end up becoming Cisco or someone else being the bad guy? You know, so that is the dangers. That's what I'm seeing like they could set for. It'd be cool if I ended up being right, but I mean, maybe I am wrong about that. Because like I said, obviously everything's pointing towards Killer Frost being the one to betray Team Flash. I'm about to say Team Arrow, but who knows how that might be taken other ways. Like there's so many different paths they can take with this. They ended up also finding out that the Star Labs opening is closing too. It kind of basically fell apart. They're kind of working on that in the present. They're making it better and everything because they're like, okay, so basically with everything as it is, they're trying to open Star Labs. It's kind of a bumpy start, but it seems like with the, you know, everyone's behind it because at first it's like Cisco's very reluctant to help HR because it's like HR, you came to this time trying to get a fresh start and stuff like that. You're not kind of like you're trying to be useful, but you're just proven to be more of a nuisance than useful. But him and Cisco kind of, you know, work it out, and they get to the point where it's like, hey, they kind of make the opening a success. So that's good. Then you have the whole situation where, like, basically what they ended up doing was they ended up having Wally capture Plunder, because that way it's like the future changes, because it's like, hey, once the future's changed, it's like if we can change this event, which we did, that means other things can change too, because when Savitar attacked, they saw HR was on the back, like with his, like, you know, a gun pointed at Savitar. So many things are slowly changing. So like I said, like, you know, it's like, oh, they have the best intentions, but you know in the end of it, it's going to essentially blow up in your face. I was actually expecting something a little different when it came to Wally this episode, because they had that whole aspect with that cop played by Greg, is it Grungson? The actor who plays Matt from Heroes, the one with the mind reading ability. He was basically talking trash about the fact that he says that, yeah, Flash saved the day, but Kid Flash, he was just there, but Joe's trying to defend him for obvious reasons and stuff like that. And it's like, I was, you know, Wally overheard him trash talking, and I was thinking like, okay, so basically I felt like Wally was going to do something crazy to kind of prove himself, which he kind of, not really. I mean, he helped out Barry, and Barry kind of snapped at him, but that's because of what Barry had on his mind at the time and whatnot, the whole future situation. But then you take, you know, like, it's because of Wally's personality. It seems like it's slightly tamed, but I'm sure that's going to become a problem, is he is going to get big-headed. But at the very least, he is taking his time. He's like, you know what? I'm gonna follow your lead. You know, you lead the way, Barry, and I'm a follow away. Which I love that moment where you have like, that moment where just like they kind of like are like, yeah, after the whole finding out about the whole Iris situation, and it's like, yo, we're gonna work together. And you see that smile on Joe's face, and he even brings up later on, he's like, I'm proud of not just he's like, I'm proud of both my sons, because it's like, hey, both my sons are superheroes and going out and kicking butt, and it's just like you see that smile on his face, like the smile on his face, like I couldn't be more prouder, and I just thought that was kind of a cool moment, just like, oh, look at my boys go, being fast and saving the world type of situation. So, well, saving the day in particular. So this episode also brought about the fact is that we have Julian joining the team, which is going to be interesting seeing how that works going forward, because we always had him and Barry bumping heads as colleagues before, but now it's like, now they're going to be working together in this regard too, and he's probably going to be telling Barry, it's like, oh, no, don't do that. Are you an idiot? Just bumping heads that way too, just because it's like, you could argue it's like, he's narcissistic to a certain extent, which you could argue maybe the reason why he's narcissistic is to kind of compensate for just, all the stuff that's happened to him, because he was like, oh yeah, I'm glad to be part of the team, because my last team was brutally murdered by Savitar, and everyone's just kind of like, yeah. And then Caitlin's like, we should kind of work on that part of you, just being like, yeah, just kind of work on your social skills all day. So it's gonna be interesting seeing how he melds with the team. And it also makes you wonder, are they going to tell him about the whole future thing? I get the feeling maybe because it's like, the more heads they have on this situation, it might help. Or he might be the one to be like, are you stupid? You want to change the future? No, don't do that, you idiots, type of thing. So, who knows? But I feel like we're not done with alchemy. Maybe with Savitar returning, he decides to kind of turn Julian back into alchemy. So, we'll just kind of have to wait to see in that regard. And then I also want to comment on the last thing we saw in the episode. Some lady, comes through the rift. She's played by Jessica. I can't remember. I never remember the actress's name. Is it Camicho? I'm probably like butchering her last name. I can't remember. She played Sophie in season 3 of Sleepy Hollow. She was also on like a episode earlier on in Frequency. So the whole CW thing, actors from one show going to another type of thing. Nevertheless, it seems like she's come here specifically for HR for whatever reason that is. Like, because, HR doesn't seem like he hasn't always been that upfront about things. It's only until afterwards he's kind of like, yeah, that's kind of the reason, like this and that. It's like, okay, actually I'm not that smart of a dude. It's actually my partner that was smart. I'm just kind of the idea guy. But it seems it's gotten to the point the team is trusting him, but now, I don't know, it's like this person is hunting him down. Now, either it's for like, oh, she's actually someone important to him, the reason why she's trying to chase him down, or it's because he did some very bad things, or maybe he took something with him when he left. Because Cisco said something earlier in the episode being like, oh, maybe your partner helped solve that riddle, that whole problem that we sent out to all those different Earths because he wanted to get rid of you. It's like, maybe he was going to go himself, but HR is the one that jumped forward, and now they've been trying to track him down this entire time, trying to figure out exactly what Earth, he was in or something. Maybe maybe it's just the fact is that, obviously his past isn't as clear as he makes it out to be. Like, oh, he's just some kind of, oh yeah, like, cause he kind of embarrassed himself because it's like, everyone found out that he was only the face for his Star Labs. So it's kind of like, maybe it's connected to that, but it's like, would someone really cross the multiverse just for something like that? It has to be something specific. So, we'll have to wait and see how that all plays out. But a very good episode. I'm very interested to see how this whole storyline changes up. It's very interesting, too, because the opening actually changed to compensate for this, too. Like, this is the first time that's ever happened to my knowledge. Like, usually the openings change, season to season, but this is like the first time that's happened mid-season, hasn't it? Because it's compensate for the new story of like, oh, he's got to change the future to save Iris. So, I thought that's kind of interesting. But I'm very interested to see how this whole changing the future arc kind of works out. So, and now moving on to this week's episode of Legends of Tomorrow. Basically, we have the official titling of the Legion of Doom. Like, I do love the fact that they kept smacking in your head, the Legion of Doom, the Legion of Doom. Even starts like, I'm not calling them that. It's like, okay, it's understandable. But the Legion of Doom is hunting down the Spear of Destiny. Specifically, they're hunting down Rip because a big part of the episode is finding out what exactly went down with Rip. They ended up in a situation where we saw back in the mid-season finale about Rip and being like, in 1967 Los Angeles. Well, it turns out that basically Rip basically touched a time drive, and he took a stick with him, but he wiped Gideon, like had Gideon kind of shut off because he knew she wouldn't agree with what he was going to do. So essentially, the Rip we see before us is the real Rip, but basically his personality, his memories and stuff have been wiped away. Obviously, they're still there because apparently he's a director in 1967, and he's basically making a movie based around the first seasons of Legends of Tomorrow. He's like, I don't know, this stuff comes to me, but it's like basically his repressed memories. He basically wrote it into a screenplay. There's a slight joke, I don't know how to take it, that basically it's like, oh man, we've got to recast Vandal Savage. I don't know whether that's an inside joke because it's kind of like, because when you hear certain things, like to me that was always something like I've heard people snap about, like about the first season, being like, oh, they didn't really like Vandal Savage because he wasn't the scary, intimidating person that probably is from the comic books and stuff like that, or how he was in Young Justice, for example. So I don't know if that was a kind of like a response, them kind of making fun of the fact is that a lot of people felt like that. Maybe that's what the creators behind the show really felt. I hope that's not the case, but I don't know. Nevertheless, it just seemed like they were kind of making fun of that. So it's like, oh, I can't get the raw emotion out of this. Oh, we're just gonna have to recast the character. So I thought that was kind of funny. Because the Spirit of Destiny has the power to rewrite everyone's destiny. It does make you, well, I can kind of see why everyone wants it for their respective reasons. Obviously, Dark, because he learned from Sarah what his future beholds. Eobard probably make himself into the hero he always wanted to be. It's like, he probably for once in his life get rid of Barry, because it's like every time he's tried to get rid of Barry, it hasn't worked out for him. I mean, because he doesn't necessarily know exactly how his timeline ends, does he? I don't think he does. I mean, for all we know, maybe he does, but I'm sure more so than anything, it's just he wants to kind of destroy Barry, because it's like with the Spear of Destiny, you don't have to worry about the ramifications of changing time, because time, you don't know what the ripples would do, but for like the Spear of Destiny, you literally rewrite history, you can rewrite reality. But the difference between that and changing the past or just changing time in general, it's like time is always flowing. It's like very, malleable. It can be formed in any shape or form. But with the Spear of Destiny, you can make any changes you make permanent. So I can only assume Malcolm wants to do it because it's like, well, it means bringing his son back, which I forgot that is what he brought up last episode, but I'm sure also his wife too, just because that's, especially because his son ended up dying because of what he did. His need for revenge against the Glades and stuff like that, trying to make a better place, it led to everything like that happening. He ended up killing his own son for his need for vengeance, essentially. So, but something that kind of came across my mind, like at the end of the episode, we had Sarah with because apparently the Spear of Destiny is broken into pieces. It's not actually fully intact. The only person who knows where the pieces are is Rip, but as we know, Rip doesn't remember anything about being himself or anything that he knew. All of it's coming back to him in pieces, but he always thought they were something else. But the fact is, at the end of the episode, we have Sarah holding one of the pieces, and to me, I was like, could this be what the whole Laurel thing is about in Arrow? Because obviously the previews have been coming up, and I've been avoiding them as much as possible. Anytime it comes up, I'll mute the TV and look away until it's over, because I'm going into that blind. Obviously, we'll get the answer soon enough about that whole Laurel situation. I was like, could that be it? Could Sarah have used the spear to kind of rewrite Laurel's history, or is that even possible with the spear being in the state that it's in? Maybe you need the whole thing before that can happen. So. Or maybe, I don't know, because it's hard to say, because it's like, the fact is they've moved the show up earlier in the week, so it could be for those particular reasons, is because, Legends needs to be on a new night because it's how it's going to affect Arrow and stuff like that, so you need to see the effects happen first on Legends before you see what happens on Arrow, or, just because right now, it and Flash are the big time travel shows, obviously, so, I don't know, it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. This episode had a lot of lightheartedness to it that I really appreciate, because the whole situation is that basically the person that was helping Rip do his movie was George Lucas, and that essentially he gets so freaked out about the whole situation that he drops out of film school, and that ends up affecting both Ray and Nate, because for Ray it's Star Wars inspired him to become the scientist that the smart dude that he is, and basically led to him creating the atom suit. It played at events like that. And for Nate becoming an archaeologist and historian is because of Indiana Jones. And it's like the moment George Lucas decided, I was like, oh, he's done with it. It changed time, and both Ray and Nate just kind of start like, oh wait, what's up with this? Like, wait, I can't read this. I can't understand this thing in their respective fields. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I was like, okay, wait, whoa. At first, it happened with Ray. I'm like, oh, is this because of Rip? It's like, what? I was like, at first, before you find out about Rip's situation, I'm like, oh, did Rip catch, like, is it because a Spear of Destiny rewrote his memories and now it's like rewriting theirs or something because they're in close contact or something? It's like, oh, are we going to have the whole ship dealing with that? It's like, no. It's just because of their respective situation with George Lucas. So they basically had to convince him to basically make the movies, eventually go off to become a director so that he can make the movies that help make them into the superheroes that they are today. So that's kind of interesting. Kind of a nice little subplot. Because Nate did bring up earlier in the episode, he's like, oh, I never mentioned the fact that Indiana Jones inspired me. I was like, the moment I heard it, I was like, huh, that's kind of interesting. Weird random fact to kind of throw out. But it's like, yeah, that's because they were foreshadowing that. So that's kind of cool. Because obviously there were, I don't know. It's hard to say, but like, there's a whole situation with Sarah and Rip. It's like, because at the end of the episode, obviously Rip gets taken, but it's like the way Sarah's so distraught. Like the rest of the team is kind of sad too, but it's like she got hit harder than anyone else. I guess because at first it seemed like there might have been something between her and Snart, which there kind of possibly was, and now it's like later on it was kind of like, oh, maybe there's something between her and Rip, which there possibly was, and it's kind of like, it's hard to say, like, was it just because it's like, because for her, she even says it herself, like the reason why she follows Rip is because he saved her life. He gave her purpose. He gave her this mission. So it's like she's indebted to him to that. He saved her life. He gave her purpose, kind of got her away. It's because he brought her onto the ship that she was able to kind of get past her bloodlust thing. She never doesn't have to really worry about that anymore because it's like she was able to kind of find her way through it, on this adventure she's been a part of, so she kind of owes Rip for that too. So, but it seems like there's feelings involved too. The reason why she was like very distraught about the fact that, I guess it's also because she's the leader of this team and she's like, none of this would be possible without Rip, and it's just kind of like, she's like, it's like I'm in this situation temporarily until we get Rip back, So another interesting thing that kind of popped up in this episode is Malcolm and Damien like talking and being buddies. Like that's a new, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it right now. It's dynamic is the word I'm looking for. Thank goodness that came to me, like that we've never seen before. Because Malcolm and Damien actually obviously have talked, back in like season 4, obviously when they joined forces, during the whole Genesis situation. But that doesn't change the fact is that they never really had too many interactions, but now we have them interacting, and it's just like, oh, they're in 67. It's like, oh man, Malcolm's like, oh, we should go see Frank Sinatra after we're done. And then Dark's like, really? No, we got to do this. It's like, yeah, I said we do this first, then we go check on him afterwards. And it's almost like a bad guy buddy cop type of situation. Like obviously buddy cop, but obviously replace that with bad guys. That's what I was trying to say, but I phrased that terribly. And it's just like, even like little moments here and there, just like killing both those bikers to steal their bikes, just like the fact is waiting in the elevator and stuff like that. Just like, it's like, I don't know, it's so interesting seeing them interact like that, because like we never really seen them talk like that. Because another thing too is, it isn't explicitly saying where specifically in time this Malcolm is. If this is a Malcolm that Eobard tracked down, at what point in time is he from? Obviously he knows Sarah and stuff, but is this a Malcolm before he joined the whole Genesis situation? I like to think it's him, after that, because he knows Damien's future. But I guess it's like, he doesn't really give a crap about Damien. It's like all that matters is himself, trying to fix his own situation. So it's like they're partners out of convenience, because it's like, okay, we need to work together to get the Spear of Destiny, because we all need to change our fate. So another storyline element in this episode was the whole situation with Mick, because Mick kind of confides in Martin about the whole situation of like, oh, seeing Snart and everything. Which at first it's like, oh, maybe there's something more to it, because we end up finding out that there's basically a chip inside of Mick's head that's kind of like a receiver. It's basically been in his head ever since the Time Masters made him Kronos. They did some stuff to him. So it's like, oh, because, Martin's theory is that basically when what happened to Snart happened, basically his body was split up into like millions of particles spread across time and everything, and that basically you have Mick kind of being a receiver of that, but it turns out not to be the case because the chip hasn't been active for a while. What I really appreciate is the fact is that like basically Mick is like, yo, I need you to get this out of my head, and it's like, I'm not a surgeon. He's like, you'll find a way to do it right. She's like, yeah, I'll work with Gideon, and literally he's doing the surgery and everything, and you have Jax and Sarah walking past him like, what are you doing? He's like, doing brain surgery. Isn't it obvious? Like, it's so matter of fact, and no one bothered asking any questions. You're just like, whatever, we're off to go save the rest of the team, and just never brought it up again. So they're just kind of like, okay, you just do whatever the hell you're doing. So, which it turns out, basically in Martin's mind, he's basically like, the reason why Mick is seeing Snart is basically it's essentially Mick is struggling with two voices inside of his head. His inner, like, because there's part of him that's like okay with being a part of the team. He's glad to be a part of the team, even though he pretends like he isn't. But there's a side of him that's like, oh, Snart is talking. It seems that part of him is basically being like, oh, there's the criminal side of him, the bad guy side of him. It's like, oh, you're growing too weak. You're up here trying to be a part of this team and everything. You'll never fit in. You'll always be an outsider type of situation. And so it seems like that's what caused all this, which I'm like, okay, I'll accept that for now, but I'm like, there has to be a lot more to it. Because what I was thinking, because I've been beating around the bush, I'll go ahead and say it, like, I already got it spoiled for me, and I just to kind of get the context out there, it's because it's going to be more confusing if I talk circles around it. But basically, I spoiled that basically what I've heard, it could turn out not to be true, but that Snart is going to join the Legends, that they're going to pick him up at some point in time. I don't know. Obviously, it's going to be him at an earlier point in time. I don't remember if I've talked about this. I might be sitting here getting worried about spoiling something, but I think I've actually brought that up before. I can't remember if I went in detail about it. I think I did in an earlier episode of this. I don't know. Whatever the case may be. If it is, then I'm just being redundant. If it's not the case, then I do apologize once again for kind of spoiling it. But what I was thinking was that basically the whole thing was them messing with Mick. It's like the real, Leonard from like Snart from a different point in time is working with the Legion of Doom, and then he is tapping into the receiver and messing with Rory's head. But it's like, oh, well, Mick, so we don't get caught up with the whole confused Rory situation. But it's like, it seems like it was deactivated, so that turns out not to be the case. But I still get the feeling like, that's going to turn into something like him physically seeing it. I mean, maybe it is kind of like a feeling of like, he lost his best friend, his only friend for the longest time. So, of course, that kind of have some like psychological effects on him and stuff like that. But I feel like it's got to be more than that basically things are working that way because Leonard is presenting himself. Because those other times we saw Snart, and I guess it was to give a visual aid to what's happening with Mick, but this time we never saw him, so that's why maybe conflicting schedules and stuff like that, so maybe they couldn't get him, but from a production standpoint, but it does beg the question of like, I get the feeling there is more to that, or maybe it's a situation, because we have yet to see him, and it seems like the Legion has already formed up, so maybe it's going to be something where it comes back, oh, let's get Snart later on. They didn't make the decision to get him because they know it would have like a psychological effect on the team. Maybe. I don't know. That could be where that's going. So maybe this all really is stemming from Mick's feeling. I feel like it's more, but maybe I'm making more out of something that isn't there. So maybe the whole Snart thing was wrong, or maybe that's not something that's going to come up until much later on. Different questions. I did appreciate the situation where Rip, I forgot his fake name, Phil, tried to play the role of being Rip, and he's like, oh yeah, and he's got the gun and everything, he's click, click, click. He's like, oh crap, just give me a sec. He's like, okay, how do you work this gun? He's like, oh crap, forget it. So basically saying, Gideon, give them everything you've got, and firing at them like that. So, like I said, it was a very nice episode. It was like a weird episode because it had like, obviously Legends always has a lighthearted element to it, but I feel like definitely in this episode they really kicked up the lighthearted nature of it. Like I said, just that I've not done a good enough job describing, but it's just like something about Merlin and Dark in this episode, really just them bonding together almost. It felt cool. It's like I want to get more of that, them bonding, just talking, just casual bad guy conversation. I just thought it was kind of nice because the only person we haven't really seen partake in that is Eobard, and I do like the fact that they're like, where have you been this entire time? And I was literally thinking, I was like, oh, I guess Reverse Flash isn't going to pop. Oh, there you are, just popping in enough time. Like it's like, oh, Malcolm and Dark are cornered. It's like, oh, I guess there is like, oh, there you are in time just to kind of literally take everyone down in a matter of seconds, in a matter of like 2 or 3 seconds. Kind of phrase it a little differently. But he was basically, they're like, where have you been? He's like, I've been off working. He's like, but even though I'm been off, doing work, but he's like always, I show up on time. So that was kind of interesting. Makes you wonder what other stuff has he been up to? Because you would think, I mean, whatever, the plans that he has laid out is like, obviously, he's been thinking about it for a long time. He's probably off traveling to other time periods. It makes you wonder at what point in time. Okay, once again, like just like we don't know which Malcolm this is, we don't know which Eobard this is. So is this the Eobard that was captured by Barry dealing with the whole Flashpoint situation, or is this like have we already met like maybe Eobard at some point? At times he's been away. Maybe he was off doing the first episode of Flash, that basically being caught by Barry and taking the Flashpoint, stuff like that, or maybe it's already happened for him. It's like. Time travel is confusing, and it's like there's no telling which way is the right way to think about it. So it's just like it makes you wonder, like any point he's disappearing, is he off going to do Flashpoint? That question just kind of randomly popped in my head. So, but we do have them capturing Rip at the end of the episode, and obviously Malcolm and Dark are going to torture him to get the information they need, trying to figure out this whole Spear of Destiny situation. So the point is that the team is going to work together, and they're going to try and figure out how to rescue Rip. I'm curious to know, like, will Rip be getting, because I was wondering is he going to get his memories back in time for him to kind of join back up with the team, or is he always going to be kind of like, is it going to be like a permanent return to the team type of situation, or what? Like, at what point in time did Rip get his hands on a Spear of Destiny, even the fraction that he's got, who has the other pieces? Is it something that he's always had? Because the thing is, like, if he has a fraction of the Spear of Destiny, why didn't he ever use it himself to take care of someone like Savage, or save his family? I guess arguably it's like, because it's such a dangerous thing, you have to be careful with it, because it's like, yeah, it can shape reality, but because it's so powerful enough that it can shape reality, who's to say you shape reality doesn't end up breaking it? Kind of causing a similar situation to Flashpoint. Is like you trying to recreate, change that fate like that, change reality like that, ends up cracking it and slowly breaking apart, like Flashpoint was doing to the timeline. Because it's also like we still are not 100% clear on that whole situation. It was brought up during the crossover, obviously the message from Barry from like 2056 about the war that's coming. I'm sure like the Legion of Doom is mixed in there with also Savitar. So, possibly the Savitar situation. It's like, the fact is that Barry was like, oh, don't even trust me. I feel like that has not been covered yet. I get the feeling like maybe that's something we're going to see in Legends. It's hard to say. I didn't really talk about it in Flash, but maybe that might be something we end up seeing in Flash too, especially with this whole situation of traveling to the future. Maybe Barry will meet an older version of himself. Maybe it'll coincide with Legends or something like that. We just kind of have to wait and see how that all plays out. So now moving on to this week's episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Very interesting. In this episode, we got a little bit more, kind of coinciding with what I brought up before about technically Radcliffe not being a bad guy, because you have Ida being like, why don't we just kill Agent May? He's like, whoa, we don't kill her, because obviously this whole like LMD situation with the fake May, it's not perfect, so we need to keep her around to kind of keep the LMD kind of, working. The fact of the matter is, it's like, keep it in operating order, in case, something goes wrong. And also it's like, we're not murderers too, but she's like, the fact is, it'd be so much simpler just to kill May, because like we still don't know like what Radcliffe plans to do after it's all said and done. I guess like to him it won't matter once he's got the Darkhold and got what he's needed, because it's like, the ends will justify the means. Of the fact is that once I do get the Darkhold and kind of show them like, my true vision of having these LMDs kind of protect people, that's all he really wants. So it's arguably you see the good side to him, but it's like you see all the manipulating he does too as well. You kind of like, is it real? Because, once the Darkhold is involved, it's like even the most pure of intentions can turn dark, so you also find out what kind of, I do appreciate the little cut at the beginning where it's like, we saw when May got taken. She hasn't been taken that long. She was only gone for like 5 days. Then we found out about like, what May saw that made her kind of wake up originally. And it's like, oh, she's getting like she's at essentially it looks like it might be kind of like a sauna. She's basically about to get massaged. She doesn't buy it, and then she woke up in the whole situation attacking Radcliffe, and then kind of got knocked out again. This time they put her in a simulation where it's like, oh, to fit her more perfectly, like, oh, run through some trials of basic, like, oh, she thinks she's escaping. The moment like they're like, oh, we won't have to worry about killing her, it'll be okay. Like this time Agent May is kind of under it completely, and then she wakes up. I'm like, I didn't buy it for a second. I was like, it's part of the simulation. I already know it. And it turns out to be the case that basically they have her running a program because it's like, oh, she lives off of action and stuff like that. So we have her fight and try to find her way out of her. I think they call the whole system framework. But basically each time that she gets out, she ends up getting better and better. It's getting to the point that they basically can't even create programs fast enough to compensate for the fact that she keeps breaking through it. Like that's how like she figures it out at the end. It's like, oh, each time, but they end up wiping her memory and making her restart the simulation over again. Also, the reason why I'm kind of slightly kind of figured it out already, because a similar thing kind of happened in Person of Interest, me and my viewing TV type of situation. Similar thing happened to Shaw, so that was kind of like, I felt like that was kind of a similar thing. It's just like, to me, the fact is that she was not, also I was like, they tailored the story where it makes you think like, oh, maybe she's getting away, but it's like at the same time, it's like they tailored it that way because it's like they don't want like it to seem like May escaping is going to affect things. They want things to kind of proceed on their own because it's like really two separate storylines you're seeing rather. Well, technically they are all one storyline because it kind of like all comes full circle when fake May is starting to bring up questions about like, oh, because she started asking Fitzel like, oh, what about the whole Ida situation? Was she kind of aware of what she was doing? Could she have come back from it essentially? Because she's wondering like, because May starts wondering, she's like, is she a danger? Could it be like she goes through the situation of not realizing like, oh, like what she's really programmed to do and stuff like that, and starts thinking like, well, what if she kind of goes in a similar situation where like Ida, would she be able to pull herself back or not? She kind of warns that she's a danger for everyone, and she ends up confronting Radcliffe. I was not expecting that circumstances, but then basically she's like, oh, who's to say I won't tell anyone? It's like, the reason why you haven't told anyone is because you're programmed not to want to tell anyone, and she can't even hurt Radcliffe because just her programming won't allow her. He's revealing everything to her because he knows she won't say anything, because it's like, think that deep down, what is it you want? And what she wants is Coulson. Like the fact is that because she has all of May's memories and stuff like that, but she's acting like, I'm sure he tweaked her programming a little bit to make it so, because she's not actually acting exactly like May. She's kind of building on like what's already there with May. I think it's going to be a circumstance of like, a big reason why she wouldn't tell the truth either, even if she could, is because she wants to be May. Because it's hard to say, like, because Radcliffe himself is like, oh, it's hard to say which are May's memories and which are just part of your programming. And I'm thinking she's fallen for Coulson. And, if the real May comes back, that means she'll kind of be revealed to be a fake and they'll probably dispose of her. I mean, she might not even be thinking that far. It's just, she's probably just thinking in the here and now. She wants to be with Phil. That's what she really wants. I think more so than anything, it's like, even finding out what she is, she wants to be May. And I think that's what it's ultimately sadly going to come down to. Is like, because I was wondering if she was going to, muster up the courage to finally tell them that, when it's all said and done. But it's like, she couldn't even if she wanted to. It also seems like there's part of, like, she can't do anything to interfere with her, like, her mission that's connected to the Darkhold and everything. We know that, but she doesn't know that because Radcliffe didn't tell her. So it kind of coincides with the point. I'm like, Radcliffe, kind of the bad guy, but like I said, he is kind of going about things the proper way in a sense, because it's like he's going about things in a way where no one gets hurt. Because anyone getting killed, that agent that died, that was kind of Ida just, a tweaking her programming, going too far to uphold a mission. Because basically for her, it's like the end's just, I know I say that way too much, I need to stop saying that, but basically the many outweighs the one. So it's like, shit, why she kind of says like, shouldn't we just kill Agent May? Because it's like she could jeopardize everything, and it's like, sacrifices have to be made, the sacrifices of one to protect the many. As I get the Darkhold and everything, and he can really advance the LMD program to, he can really learn how to kind of fix any problems, like, I guess, make the perfect AI to, serve the purpose of protecting. Like I said, start off with the best of intentions. It seems like that might be what his goal is. Maybe it's not, but it seems like he wholeheartedly believes that. But I mean, granted, at the end of the episode, we ended up finding out that basically the Radcliffe we've been seeing this entire time isn't a real Radcliffe, because he kept bringing up, he's like, oh yeah, there's a second LMD. I'm like, oh, who else has been replaced by an LMD? And the one that was replaced was him. He'd replaced himself after the whole debacle with the Darkhold, like the original Ida, the one that got her head lopped off by Mac. After that went down, he replaced himself with an LMD. And coinciding back with the point of being a bad guy, basically the whole plan was like during the whole Accord situation, it was like, oh, asking questions about Daisy, is like asking her about questions about her going undercover for S.H.I.E.L.D. and stuff like that. What ended up coming out is that, because everyone on board is kind of on the board of the whole situation is okay, except the Senator Nadir is a part of it, and bringing up questions of stuff like, it's like, oh, if you had to choose between Inhumans, would you help them over humans? And she's like, no, I would help everyone, because it's like, oh yeah, it's like, oh, looking at the best interest of Americans, and she's like, no, Inhumans are Americans too, And she's like, so she would protect, working for the government, she would protect everyone equally. She's like, but, Inhumans don't get the proper representation that they deserve and stuff like that. She's like, the fact is that Inhumans are just like anyone else. They're our friends, our co-workers, and looks at Nadir, our brothers, wherever they may be. And just like, yeah, you stick it to her. But that made Nadir come back even harder. Because basically the whole situation was a cult, like basically they'd been blown from the beginning, because Yo-Yo and Coulson were going to break into her office and put up some surveillance, which Talbot was super against, but they went along with it anyway, and they ended up getting busted for it. And now, now she has proof to be like, okay, now we need to investigate S.H.I.E.L.D. or, break up any skeletons they have to use against them, kind of, like in a legitimate way, use the government. Like, before she's going about things her own way, but now she's kind of legitimized any problems she has with S.H.I.E.L.D. because of this. Because it's kind of interesting, because you have three sides actually. You have Talbot being like, keep S.H.I.E.L.D. on the up and up, He has a right to say it because he's the one that kind of brought S.H.I.E.L.D. back together after everything happened, Coulson kind of stepped down and everything. Talbot's the one that kind of brought things back together, He kind of put in charge of things. And you have Coulson being like, no, we need to act more, because the fact is Talbot doesn't always give you the proper information. He gets a lot of secrets and stuff like that, kind of the political stuff, but also because it's kind of a situation like, oh, it's stuff that's on a need-to-know basis, because he knows Coulson, for as long as they've known each other. So he knows how Coulson operates. And Coulson's like, I try, Coulson can be a little reckless in a sense. And then you have Jeffrey, in the middle, he's like, he's playing the role of director, but it's kind of like, it's kind of an interesting thing of like, now that the charade's up, you see like any words he has, any weight to them are kind of falling on deaf ears, because it's like, because Mason's like, yeah, I agree with Coulson. We should go about this. We should go what he says, because the chances need to be taken, because we need to take care of the senator, because it's like, she's a bad person, so this might be our only opportunity. He's like, oh, of course she would agree with Coulson, just because it's like, you have to in this whole circumstances. So you kind of feel bad for Mace. And even that conversation he had with Daisy, basically being like, be careful, like, he looks at Daisy, he's like, he knows that Daisy kind of had to pretend, like, always, like, she doesn't talk about much of her earlier life, that she had to pretend to be someone else, depending on who she was around, just to kind of fit in. And he's like, I know better than anyone, having to pretend. But he's like, be careful pretending that it doesn't end up affecting the rest of your life, that you don't end up pretending in every aspect of your life, just kind of to be you and don't lose yourself amongst it. Because Jeffrey, with us all said and done, like, he has to live a lie 24/7, and it's hard to say, like, what's him anymore, what's him and what's the lie, like, who is him, who's the real Jeffrey Mace, and like, who's the Jeffrey Mace that was created, quote unquote, created to be the director. So, but the point I was getting to is the fact is that we found out that Radcliffe is the one who betrayed it. Because I was thinking it was Mac, but we ended up finding out Mac's situation. I was like, oh, don't let it be Mac, and it's not. But I'll kind of get to that in a second. But the fact is that he sold out S.H.I.E.L.D. for Senator Nadir's protection. But now, like, Fitz, because I love that Fitz figured it all out, because the whole thing, like, Fitz looking into Ida was a good thing. And, Simmons was pissed because she's like, you kept this from me. She's like, I knew you needed your time to process it, but this isn't the way you do it. She's like, oh, this could have led to the whole situation about this could have been the reason why Nadir found out about us, because it's like, oh, there's a leak in S.H.I.E.L.D. and everything, which at first Coulson's like, oh, it's you, Talbot. And Talbot's like, no, it's not me. I wouldn't do that. Like, S.H.I.E.L.D. wouldn't be here without me. He's like, oh, maybe that's the best thing. So, which is kind of sad, because now we have S.H.I.E.L.D. kind of in shambles to a certain degree. It's like, you find out the director is not the real director. S.H.I.E.L.D. is being investigated by the government, essentially. Nadir has all the power she needs to kind of tear S.H.I.E.L.D. apart, essentially. You have Talbot and Coulson on opposite sides rather than working together, because he's like, you're stronger together. The fact is that S.H.I.E.L.D. has been kind of divided for a little while, and it's like they still need to both halves need to come together to come to some kind of compromise. And like I said, at the very middle, we have Jeffrey. Like, I feel like him and Skye might be the best option at trying to fix this whole situation. So Skye, I meant Daisy. I literally said Skye. I had to take a second. I was like, did I just say? And I did. Daisy. I've been so adamant about not slipping up like that, and I let it slip. I do apologize. But the fact is that Fitz was like, no, he's been investigating. This whole thing has been an investigation. Was it, it's not an obsession, because he's trying to figure out, it's like, he kept looking at the situation like there was something off and something was wrong, and he figured out the whole, Radcliffe situation, and also finding out that Radcliffe was at LMD. It's like, I didn't catch on until Fitz caught on too. He was like, yeah, I'm just here. My number one priority is to protect. And then the Fitz looked at him and was like, wait, are you he's an LMD? And I was wondering, because the whole point is that LMD is not supposed to know that they're LMD. In May's case, she's not supposed to know, but maybe his fake was allowed to know, because it's like, makes him but at the same time, it's kind of the same reason with May. It's like, you won't interfere with your own plan if you think you're real. So maybe his fake self thought he was real too, just like May did. So, but, yeah. Like I said, I keep liking what they do with Radcliffe's story, because there's always these nice twists, finding out he's a bad guy, now finding out this whole time he's been in hiding, because like, that was a fake him the entire time. So it's just always nice, interesting turns. So, a conversation that kind of came up in this episode, it kind of affects both Coulson and Mac and Yo-Yo, which we have the whole Yo-Yo situation, and Yo-Yo sees Mac get that suspicious text, and he kind of leaves, and I'm like, is it connected to that? And then I was like, because Mac is very secretive, because Yo-Yo and Coulson have a conversation, which we've never really seen them interact too much, but end up having conversations like, she's like, what do you know about Mac's situation? And Coulson's like, I'm not going too deeply into that. He's like, that's Mac's personal business. He's like, honestly, even with all the time he's been around Mac, he doesn't know Mac that well. He's like, what he knows about Mac is only from his files. And it's kind of a conversation of like, oh, knowing all there is to know about someone versus like learning about them, slowly. Like, so in Yo-Yo's case, it makes sense why Yo-Yo is like that, wanting to learn everything there is to know about someone, because she likes to be fast. Kind of coincides with her power and everything. But it's kind of I guess another way to kind of break it down would be like learning all there is to know about someone from social media. It's like, oh, someone has like a complete run of their bio, all this information, their likes and their dislikes, favorite type of music, their favorite movies, what they like doing in their personal time. But for Coulson, it's about, that interaction, that, talking to that person, taking things slowly. Once again, not Yo-Yo style. But she also brings up the fact is, like, you can't be taking things slowly, because, like, taking things slowly will mean you and Agent May will never get together. And he's like, what are you talking about? It's not even like that. She's like, yeah, it totally is. Everyone can literally see that. In her case, she's like, I don't need a file to tell me what's going on there. I can obviously see it. So, and then you have the situation with him and May. Obviously, fake May is kind of like touching his shoulder and everything. It's like, part of me is like, are you about to kiss? It's like, no, it didn't happen, but it's like, it's getting there. Like I said, it's going to be fake May trying her best to like keep everything under wraps, to be May without letting anything slip or let anything, come out that, oh, she might not be the real May, which I'm sure, I didn't think about it at the time, but I'm sure like the reveal of Radcliffe is going to push things in a different direction, because it's like, well, now that Radcliffe's been brought out to be an LMD, it's like anyone could actually be an LMD that we just don't know has been replaced. So that means fake May is going to have to be on her toes to kind of cover her tracks. So, because I figured this whole situation with Mac, before the suspicions, I was like, oh, the way he's looking sad and everything. I was like, so this has to be connected to the whole Ghostwriter thing. Like back when he was possessed by the writer latched onto him for a different reason than it did Robbie. For Robbie, it was like anger and revenge is what fueled it. But there was no such thing like that inside of Mac. But for the writer in Mac, he was like, oh, I can hold on to him because there's a bit of sadness in him, an extreme sadness that I can latch on to. And we ended up finding out what that sadness is connected to. Mac had a little girl named Hope, but she died like 11 years ago. She was on, like, there were complications, and basically she only lived to be about 4, and that basically the person he was texting with is his ex-wife, that basically they get together, try to, he tries to be there for her, but at the same time it's like he also acknowledges that he kind of wants her to be there for him, because it's like he doesn't think he can handle that day alone, because basically the next day, after the next following day after this episode would be her birthday. So he kind of opens up the yo-yo about that. It's like, the fact is, like, I mean, and that's something too that showed, that's why he's always been so slow about things going forward with her, because having Hope was kind of an unexpected thing that happened between his ex-wife and him, because basically they kind of took things fast, and things just they all happened at once. So that's why he's just been very reserved. Like, oh, he has his feelings about Yo-Yo, but he's been scared to admit them, because I think he's afraid of going too far. I think he wants to take things slow, because he's probably afraid that if he goes fast with things, it'll be a repeat of that type of situation, and he doesn't want to be in that situation again. Whether it be like, losing another child, or maybe in circumstances lead to him losing. It's his own way. It's a defense mechanism of protecting his heart, like, so his heart doesn't get broken again after having to survive another tragedy like that, which is like, it's too much for anybody to handle, So a situation like that would obviously put you on your guard going forward. So another thought that kind of crossed my mind is like, oh, maybe Mac was the one that was like, still processing. I was like, oh, maybe Mac would, before that came out, that like maybe he was the one replaced by an LMD. So, I mean, truth be told, you don't 100% know like who else might have been replaced. 2 final notes I kind of want to cover, things that kind of both came up at the end of near the end of the episode. One is that we having Nadir saying like, oh, basically if Radcliffe wants her protection, she's going to have to meet with, well, she can't be the one to really help him. The one that has to help him is the superior. So maybe next episode we finally get a look at the person leading the watchdogs. But I'm guessing this also means they're going to want Radcliffe as a means of armoring them with the LMDs as well, because they might be like, oh, this would be our weapons against the Inhumans. But then arguably it's like the LMDs, like Ida, for example, it's supposed to be a shield, but now it's like maybe the watchdogs would want him to turn her into a sword. And it's like, then it becomes a question of like, for, Radcliffe, he has in his mind like, oh, he'd rather not kill people, but if it means getting what he wants, maybe he will cross that line, because he'll be like, oh, it's for the greater good. It's like, yeah, I might have to sacrifice some few people, but it's sacrifice the few to save the many. It's like, once I get the Darkhold, everything will be okay. Those sacrifices won't be in vain. So maybe he'll have that same mentality. But to me, almost like the most heartbreaking thing, like, it's not really heartbreaking. I mean, because obviously the most heartbreaking thing is the whole like story, like whole situation with Mac about his little girl. That's the most heartbreaking thing. But it's kind of super sad in its own way. It's the new simulation that they've created for May. It's kept her at ease, so they don't have to worry about keep creating a new program to kind of keep her busy, because it's like she keeps besting him, and eventually she would have broken down. This new programming is basically taking her back to the day, the fight that she lost, and letting her actually win it. Because that fight is what changed everything for May. It's why she keeps fighting so hard. It's basically taking her back to the moment she became known as the Cavalry. But instead of like, the situation being everyone died in the situation, this time she was able to save the little girl. She's even talking to Andrew, but like, oh, I saved her. So like for her, that probably, it's going to be interesting seeing what that means for the next episode, where we probably see the simulation and see like, will it be a situation where she actually breaks free of the simulation herself, or will it be a situation that she completely submits to it? I mean, so far it seems like it might be submitting, but it's like, you never know. Like maybe for, her, like, May, she'll kind of see through it, because maybe things just won't feel right, But it's like they've calmed her down because they gave her the one victory she's never had in her life. It's probably like her biggest regret is that whole situation. So that's why it's a little heartbreaking, because it's like, that one thing changed her forever to become the person that she is now. That she kind of keeps herself distant. Because that moment is also what kind of caused problems between her and Andrew's marriage, too. So, that one moment changed everything for me. So, like I said, there's a side, because I think the most depressing thing is because it's almost like she's being taunted. It's like, oh yeah, you have the opportunity to fix everything, but it's like once she steps back into reality, it changes. It's like it doesn't change the fact is that, what happened. This is just a false reality, a false like narrative put in front of her, and it doesn't change the fact is that no matter how much, because the question is, are they going to make her relive it over and over again, or is it going to be a situation of she did it and now she lives out the rest of her life, she has a simulated life of like what she's like now that everything's worked out. It's like, oh, maybe she's back with Andrew. Maybe her job at S.H.I.E.L.D. is differently. Maybe she doesn't even work at S.H.I.E.L.D. anymore. Stuff like that. She kind of gives up fighting, and that's kind of the whole point of it. So it was very interesting. Overall, just a really good episode. I'm just very interested to see how everything plays out going forward. I brought it up a little bit, the whole Simmons and Fitz thing. I mean, she was a little pissed at him about the whole like lying to him situation, but obviously it paid off. But I'm sure there's still going to be some ramifications for that. Plus, finding out about this whole S.H.I.E.L.D. investigation, trying to what skeletons that they're going to dig up. Like I said, because S.H.I.E.L.D's done a lot of stuff in the past. Not even aside from the whole Hydra thing, they've kind of gone about things their own way. So it's kind of like obviously that's going to be thrown against him going forward. Like I said, it really comes down to Talbot and Coulson. Like they have to come together in this whole situation, but like I said, as it stands, you have S.H.I.E.L.D. almost kind of divided in that sense, in a more metaphorical than literal sense, like it was back in season 2, that it was kind of like literally divided S.H.I.E.L.D. But you get my point. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about in this episode. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.